This is Death or Prison, brought to you by leanonmeusa.org. The men you are about to hear have spent more than 50 years in prison. We bring you stories of hope and encouragement.
Hello and welcome to the Death or Prison podcast brought to you by leanonmeusa.org. I am Johnny Branham, and to my right, Mr. Elmo Golden, and to my left, our distinguished guest, the Florida Assistant Secretary of Community Corrections, Mr. Joe Winkler. We're continuing a conversation that we started last segment in regards to conditions of probation and conditions of community control and how those conditions affect offenders, the community, and even those who are charged to watch over them. One of those conditions I want to start out with and get your input, Joe, is firearms. I think that's been one of those problematic areas. Could you highlight a little bit of how that has been problematic and why it's concerning sometimes when
Yeah, I sure can. And if I can extend it to firearms or weapons, because that's where it becomes even more problematic. Whenever an individual is placed on supervision, they cannot have a firearm or weapon in their residence or in their possession. If somebody's placed on supervision or knowing they're going to be placed on supervision, I would recommend getting that weapon to an individual that can have that weapon. What may constitute a weapon? Naturally, a firearms would. Any kind of weapon that would be able to hurt somebody, metallic knuckles, a chemical agent, a bow and arrow, any of that constitutes being a weapon. If they have a question about something they may have, if it is a weapon or not a weapon, once again, they need to talk to their probation officer about it. The problem that we run into as probation officers, and I'm sure you may have heard about this before, is that they may live with somebody that has a weapon. And our rule of thumb is on that, if they have access to that area, then at that point, that weapon cannot be in that area. And we call that common area. A good example would be if a person owns the residence and they have access to that entire residence. They can't have a weapon anywhere in that residence. However, if they live with a family member, say they live with their mother and father, and the mother and father has a weapon, as long as that mother or father has the weapon in their residence, in their room, where the individual that's on supervision can't have access to it, then at that point, they're going to be in compliance with that condition. One of the things that we run into as probation officers is during our first visits, we'll go to a residence, and a common thing that we'll see is maybe a sword hanging on the wall. Well, that is a weapon. We constitute that as a weapon. And we tell the individual that they can't have that on the wall. And we may have issues with the person that lives there that owns that residence. They may not want to take that weapon down. However, if the individual wants to live there, then at that point, they're going to have to either take the weapon down or move from that residence because of that weapon being something they have access to.
Right. That's really good information because I was actually concerned about that. My father just happens to be a security guard. And I've never seen the weapon. You know, he doesn't have it in a common area, but I was always afraid, and I believe that, hey, I even had to have a conversation with him to where he agreed to move the weapon out of the house because I didn't have all this knowledge and information that I'm getting now from you, that weapon needs to be in an area, maybe under lock and key, where I can't have access to it. So that's really good information because I was under the impression that if a gun or a weapon is in the house, then I can't be in there. And I'm gonna tell you, it's bad for me because I become paranoid when it comes to my freedom now. I guard it. So I'm sitting in the house like, is there a gun in this house? Is there, And so as long as we don't have access to the weapons, then we're okay.
Yes.
Fine.
And ideally, if you have that example, that person that lives there that has that non-common area, even if they can remove it from the residence, it would really avoid some confusion in the long run.
Right.
And once again, if they have questions about what constitutes a weapon, they need to talk to their probation officer. The one thing that they can have is a common pocket knife. We allow our individuals on supervision to have common pocket knives, but it goes back to discussing that with the probation officer to make sure the probation officer is aware that they have that common pocket knife or even work tools. We know that people work in construction may have a a job or a profession that requires them to have some tools that some people, it may be constituted as a weapon, but based on their employment or what they do for a living, that would not be constituted as a weapon. But once again, speaking with the probation officer, we'll get good clarification on that.
Right. Communication.
That's a great point because I know that there's been question as to the length of a knife and just communicating. And we talked about that in our last episode about the communication between the probation officer and the person that's being supervised. Communicate. You know, if when there's a doubt, question it, bring it up, talk about it. The second of 4 issues that we're going to talk about is new law violation. The third, of course, we're going to get to is going to be drug testing, and then finally those home visits. But when it pertains to new law violations, there's some questions, there's some doubt, there's some misunderstanding out there as to what that constitutes. Could you speak to that a little bit? What constitutes a new law violation?
Yes, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked that because there is confusion amongst individuals on supervision when it comes to new law violations. And one of the areas that we have a little confusion is if somebody gets pulled over for a traffic offense, say they're out driving and they get caught speeding, that traffic offense alone is not a new law violation. Where it causes the confusion is that if that individual on supervision does not report that to the probation officer. And when we say report it to the probation officer, I would recommend if they get a traffic ticket, they get pulled over by law enforcement, or have any contact with law enforcement, to let that probation officer know immediately. And the second part to that traffic violation or contact with a law enforcement officer, whenever they report to supervision during their monthly visit, we talked about that before when they fill out their supervision report, there's an area on there that asks, have you had contact with law enforcement? It's really important that the individual puts that information on that supervision report. That way, the probation officer is fully aware that contact was made with the law enforcement officer. Now, if we go above a traffic ticket, if an individual is pulled over and they're not arrested, but they get a criminal traffic citation for driving with a suspended license, and that does happen, that is a new law violation because it is a misdemeanor offense and it's going to require a court appearance. If they get pulled over and they have marijuana on them and they get cited cited for that, but they don't get arrested, that is still a new law violation because it is a misdemeanor offense.
Well, let me ask you something. Would be the probability of that person actually going back to prison because he's driving with suspended license?
There is a possibility that would happen.
Is it high?
I don't want to say high because it's going to be up to a lot of factors. And when we report non-compliance to a court or to the releasing authority, we do what we call a violation report. And in that violation report, we should give the pertinent details of what that violation report centered around. And if that individual is truthful with us and gives us the right information, we're going to be a little bit more receptive to that new law violation. And when we make that recommendation, we may center that recommendation around something other than going back to incarceration or being incarcerated. So it goes back to being truthful and communicating with that probation officer. But there are times when there is a new law violation where that person does go back to jail and their supervision is violated, and they may pay some more severe consequences for it. But it goes back to being truthful and communicating.
I think, well, here's the reason I asked, but while I was incarcerated, I would see guys come back to prison because of a violation, and they would always tell me, oh, I just got a traffic ticket and I came back. I'm back in prison because of a traffic ticket. But what I'm saying is because we haven't gone in debt and we don't know the history of that particular individual, I believe that there had to, and this is from experience, that there had to be some other factors that made the probation officer make that type of decision to say, I'm gonna send you back. There may have been other violations before they actually got to the point, okay, this is the straw that broke the camel's back. You're driving without suspended license. Yes. So, and the reason I'm saying that, because I want to make sure that we communicate to our audience that when you do fill out that form, have you had any contact with law enforcement, that you do be truthful about it, and then you'll find out the probation officer maybe would even defend you and stop you from having a simple violation like that would cause you to be back incarcerated, and you kind of sitting there saying, I'm incarcerated behind a traffic ticket. So,
And not to split hairs, but I do have a question that just came to my mind. The red light camera. We all know the red light camera. It's not a physical person, but you do get that notice in the mail. Is that something that would constitute a new law violation or something that they need to tell their probation officer?
Yeah, once again, great question. That is a traffic ticket. It would be a traffic violation. That in itself would not constitute a violation. All they would have to do at that point is report that to the probation officer. Verbally would be great, and when they come into that for that probation office visit, to make sure they identify that on the supervision report when they fill that out. When it becomes a misdemeanor offense or higher, and at that point, that's what we constitute as a new law violation. And something I'll add to that as far as the new law violations is that there are times when an individual may be arrested for a battery, a domestic battery. They have an altercation with somebody they live with or a loved one. They may be arrested for that new law violation, and they are charged with violation of probation. For that new law violation, it takes a little bit different proof. It's proof beyond a reasonable doubt to have a conviction on that new law violation. But for the violation of probation, it's just the preponderance of the evidence. And I've seen in my career as a probation officer where we would have an individual arrested for a domestic battery. That new law violation may have been dropped in court. However, the violation stuck because the level of evidence that's required to prove that violation or prove that is a little bit lower when it comes to the violation of probation. You've got proof beyond a reasonable doubt for a new law, but for the violation of probation, it's just the preponderance of the evidence, tipping that scale in that direction. And once again, it goes back to the sentencing court, the person that's going to rule on that violation, the judge, and they're going to be the ones that make that determination of what happens to that individual at that point. Our role is we have to report that.
And that is good to know because being incarcerated 14 and a half years, I actually had the privilege, and I say privilege because I love serving people, to be a law clerk, paralegal. And that's a question that I often got asked to me in regards to, hey, I just got this charge dismissed or the court threw it out and they still violated me and I'm now sitting here in prison. Is this fair? And I had to explain to them that threshold. So it's so important for people to know that it's best to just communicate, really communicate. Drug testing is another one of those areas where I think there's a lot of questions. I've run into individuals who say, myself included, I've never had a drug offense. Why am I now having to submit to drug testing? And I guess the question is, what constitutes someone being placed under some type of criteria where they have to submit to drug testing? Is it across the board, or is there a list of criteria that an individual would fit into where they make that decision?
When an individual is placed on supervision, yes, we look at the offense that they're on supervision for, their past history, and all those factors really come into play on the frequency or how often we're going to drug test that individual. Anybody that's sentenced to felony supervision in the state of Florida is subject to that drug testing. You may come in the first time and be drug tested and maybe go 2 years without being drug tested again based on your offense or your offenses prior to that supervision period. Or you may be on for a drug offense or have some kind of substance use history in your background, and we're going to drug test more frequently. And the way we drug test, and I told this a lot when I dealt with individuals on supervision, whenever they come to probation, be prepared for a drug test. And what I mean by that is be prepared to produce some kind of specimen, because our normal drug testing method is through urinalysis. And if an individual comes into probation and they can't produce a specimen, what do? We have to sit them back out in the lobby, and they have to sit there until they can produce that specimen. It gets a little bit, I'm not sure the exact terminology, but it gets a little bit confusing to that individual on supervision, and it creates a little bit of a, miscommunication between the probation officer and that individual. So I would tell my individuals on supervision to drink some water before you come in, be prepared, because if we want a specimen produced, We want to get you in the drug testing area, get that specimen and get you out back to where you came from. And I would tell them if they're working in the construction field or outside, lawn maintenance, or they're out where they're sweating a lot, drink a little bit more water because that way they can produce some kind of fluid when they report to the probation office.
What about prescribed drugs?
Okay. If an individual's on supervision, they can take prescription medication. If they're taking prescription medication, then at that point they need to provide that prescription information to the supervisor or probation officer. If it's opiate, provide that opiate prescription to them. And if they have a medical marijuana prescription, they need to provide that as well. One thing that we run into in the Department of Corrections with individuals on supervision, they may be prescribed an opiate. And if they're prescribed an opiate and they give us the prescription and they test positive, and at that point, we're still going to send that specimen to the laboratory because we don't know actually what that opiate is. It has to match up with what the prescription they have in hand or on file matches up to. I would recommend to the individuals on supervision to provide that prescription to the probation officer on the front end and not wait to the back end. By chance, if they do come in and they test positive and they have a prescription, they haven't provided it to the probation officer, and at that point, we'll give them the luxury or the opportunity to provide that prescription to that probation officer. But once again, it's always a lot easier to take care of that situation on the front end and not wait until after a positive urinalysis takes place.
I know that we're getting ready to talk about home visits. Can we tie that in both with taking the drug test? Are you allowed to take a drug test while the probation officer is doing a home visit?
Once again, great question. Routinely, we do our drug testing within the probation offices. We are doing a change where we're going to do a pilot, and we're going to do some of that drug testing in the field, but that's coming later on down the road. At this point, all of our drug testing is within that probation office for safety reasons. Now, there's individuals that may be listening that are on federal probation or maybe even misdemeanor probation where their policy or protocol may be a little bit different. And in the future, we're going to probably implement something where we do some of that drug testing within the confines of that home or in that residence.
Are there particular things that probation officers are looking for, or what's the general basis, or what are they looking to accomplish at a home visit?
During a home visit, there really goes back to protecting the public and the expectations of the public. We're going to ensure that the individual that's on supervision is complying with their terms of supervision. They don't have weapons in that residence. They don't have drugs in that residence. They don't have something that could impact the safety of the members of the public and the citizens of the state of Florida. When we do a home visit, we have different options when we go to a individual in supervision's residence. A lot of times we may knock on the front door, talk to the individual at the front of the door, then leave. Or we may do what we call a walkthrough. We may say to the individual that we want to walk through the residence to make sure that there's nothing in this residence that would put the individual's case in non-compliance. The areas that we're going to walk through are only going to be what I referred to earlier as the common areas of the residence. If that individual lives with a mother or father, and they have an area of that residence that individual doesn't have access to, we're not going to do walkthroughs of those areas. Then we may also go to a residence and do what we call a search, or you may have heard, somebody that's incarcerated may have heard as being a shakedown. We have the authority through case law to do that, where we can go in and do searches of residences. Once again, we're not doing it to bust the chops of somebody on supervision. We're doing it because that's a statutory requirement. It's a requirement that we protect the public, and we're doing it to ensure that that individual that's on supervision is in substantial compliance with their case. Now, the expectations for our probation officers, when they do a search for residence or do a residence check, that they leave that residence in the same condition as they found it. When we go in and do a search, we want to make sure that we put things back properly and we show the individual on supervision the due respect that they deserve. So we do make sure we do that.
Is that something that they give them a heads up, or is that just something that it's just
Random?
Yeah, hopefully our probation officers are not telling individuals on supervision they're going to do a search of a residence. If I was on supervision and I had something that I shouldn't have, and you told me you were coming, well, I'm going to get rid of it. Our searches are what we call warrantless plan searches. A lot of times when we go out with a team of 2 or more people, or maybe even have a partnership with a law enforcement agency and go out and search the individual's residence. But our standard operating practice, and I hope our probation officers aren't doing it, we don't tell an individual that we're coming to search the residence.
Now, we've talked about firearms, new law violation, drug testing, and home visits. Is there any other condition that you can think of that tends to be a little problematic with individuals navigating through probation?
Yeah, one that comes to mind is that the condition they have is that they can't change their residence or employment or leave the county without permission from that probation officer. And it's a pretty simple condition, but it goes back to what we've said many a times already, is communication. As a probation officer in my career, there's been several occasions where I've had an individual on supervision that has left the county. They didn't request permission for me to do that. Then I find out from a partnering law enforcement agency or somebody outside the county that this individual left the county. And it wasn't that they left the county, it's they didn't get permission from me to do that. If they would have seek permission, asked me in advance to do that, it would not have been any kind of violation of supervision, but I didn't know on the front end, so it goes back to the communication. The same thing goes with the residence and employment, that we need to know, and we talked about the supervision report, where an individual's residing and where they're working at. If they change residences, we need to know on the front end on that. We don't need to know 30 days after they've moved. There's a reason for that, and the reason is that there may be a condition in their supervision, may be a special condition that prohibits them from living in a certain residence or a certain type of residence. And the best example would be maybe no contact with a co-defendant or no contact with a victim. If they change residences, the individual on supervision change residences and they go live with the victim or a co-defendant and their orders prohibit that, then at that point it would constitute some kind of violation of supervision. It goes back to notifying us on the front end, letting us to go through the approval process, and that way we can approve that residence and we can be informed on the front end. Also with the employment is the same thing. There's been times in my career where an individual reported to supervision, and as they came in for the month, they reported working at a lawn maintenance company. And during the course of the next 10 to 15 days or 20 days, where I didn't have contact with that individual, they may have quit that job or lost employment with that agency, and they didn't tell me until they came in during the following month. Why notify, or we notify the Sentencing and Releasing Authority on something like that? A lot of times we probably won't, but it goes back to we need to know on the front end if something like that happens, because we want the individuals on supervision to be out and looking for gainful employment. You know, if somebody's out working, they're going to be less apt to commit new offenses, and they're going to be more productive in the communities that we live in. So that's a condition that a lot of times or sometimes could trip an individual up that's on supervision.
I think that this information that the guys and women are getting now is extremely important, because I would say with conditional release, most people are going to get out under some form of supervision. And this is the opportunity for them to have the heads up so they know what to expect. Nobody's blind anymore about what's going on. I know we're going to get into resources, and that's what I'm really waiting for, to hear about what you guys have to offer. When it comes to public safety, I know that rearrests often occur. When it comes to the probation officer side of it, let's look at what takes place during that rearrest. Do you pull public records, or how does that really work?
Yeah, during the individual's period of supervision, we routinely or have intervals that we run records checks on our individuals that we supervise. We also look at clerk databases to see if they've had any kind of contact with law enforcement. If we determine that they have and we have not been notified about that, then at that point we notify either the Sentencing and Releasing Authority. What our next steps are really going to be determined by what that possible new law violation is or what that contact with law enforcement may be. But we take all new law violations very seriously, and we generally take very swift action on that, especially if we were not notified by the individual that they were arrested. If we've got somebody that had contact with law enforcement and they didn't tell us, and it's 6 or 7 months later and we notice it through a clerk database, then at that point we're going to take the steps to notify the Sentencing and Releasing Authority, and we may take even swift action on that as well.
Right. This stuff happens because, again, it boils down to communication. And I know that we haven't emphasized enough on the public protection part of it. But I look at probation officer as the I guess the between public safety and the person that has offended. And so that's how much we would like to look at the importance of the role of the probation officer, because they're standing as guard in between the offender and the offender, the probation officer and the offender. And so that's something that we wanted to highlight. And we want to really just tell the probation officer to look at the role that you're playing, because if that offender is not rearrested, it may even go even further than that during that violation. And it's a hard pill to swallow, but if you let me keep on committing crime and let me keep on doing things that are not, I guess, lawful, as a probation officer, you're not doing the public any justice.
Great point, Elmo. And it goes back to our role as a probation officer to protect the public. And that's one of the ways that we do protect the public. And the public, the citizens of the state of Florida, they have that expectation that we do just that we protect them and report those new law violations as needed.
Are there any other problematic or instances throughout the conditions where you see, maybe just briefly, where there's areas where you've seen there's an issue as far as the condition, the offender communicating?
Yeah, I think that the best answer would be for that is that there's a condition that they have to comply, the individuals have to comply with the instructions of the probation officer. And this is a really good point, because I talked earlier about the Sentencing and Releasing Authority. They impose the conditions of supervision. We merely monitor those conditions of supervision. We can give instructions to individuals to help guide them along, but we cannot impose conditions. And a good example would be if we've got an individual that we want to stay at home, but there's not a curfew that's been imposed by the Sentencing and Releasing Authority, we can't impose that curfew. But we can give instructions to individuals on supervision to help comply with conditions of supervision. And the best example of that would be if one of the conditions, which is a standard condition to maintain gainful employment, at that point we can instruct the individual to bring back job search logs showing their proof of looking for employment. So we can't impose the conditions of supervision, but we can give instructions to ensure that the conditions that have been imposed by the Sentencing or Releasing Authority are being complied with. And sometimes that's a gray area, because our probation officers don't sometimes understand what their roles are. We're not judges, we are probation officers. We don't impose, we enforce.
Two things that happened with me, and I'll speak personally, early on in my probation, I had to do that. Submit those files saying that I job searched and given proof of that. But one of the things in communicating that I was helped out with, there is what's called a day labor place in most cities and places. So my probation officer kind of went the extra mile and said, hey, Johnny, I know you're having a little bit of problem finding employment. If you just go down here every morning and check in, if they send you out, great. If they don't, that's showing me that you're putting forth the effort. And so every morning I went down to these day labor places and I signed in. They have a record, and the probation officer had a relationship with this individual and was able to call. Hey, was Johnny there this morning on Tuesday at 6 a.m. when the place opens? He's like, yes, he was. He wasn't sent out for a job because there was no availability, but that was something that I was showing that I was putting forth the effort. The other thing that I want to talk about, when you were talking about new law violation and traveling outside of the county, and I know that there's some men and women that may have this question, when you're working in multiple counties, how does that work? I'm a guy in construction. Joe's Construction says, hey, Johnny, we need you to be in Pinellas today, Pasco tomorrow, Orange County on Thursday, and then on Friday, we need you down in Seminole. How does that work?
Yeah, real life scenario that happens, and then we want our individuals out working in the community, and that does happen on a regular basis. If an individual in supervision has that scenario, they communicate that with the probation officer, and we give what we call blanket approval to leave the county for work purposes. They just have to communicate that with the probation officer. The exception is going to be if they have to leave the state for any reason. Anytime an individual leaves the state, we have to give them a hard copy travel permit outlining those travel restrictions and where they're going outside the state of Florida. But we call that blanket approval, and that does happen on a regular basis.
That's an excellent example of communicating and then being worked with.
Right.
Actually, funny story, I had a probation officer tell me, Johnny, listen, you don't have to call me every day and tell me that you're leaving the county because I had a job that required me to leave the county. He said, just tell me the counties you're going to be working in. I'll get this blanket approval. And just as long as you're going to work and back, I'm fine with that. But I was literally calling him every morning. Hey, Officer so-and-so, I'm going into Pinellas. Hey, Officer so-and-so, I'm going into Pinellas. So that's very good to know that there's that help out there. In concluding, is there anything else that you think either the community would benefit from your standpoint, is knowing that they're protected from those conditions and the offenders that may be serving probation? That's something that they need to know in closing.
Yeah, I'll tell a quick story of something that happened to me when I was a supervisor, and it really boils down to that we can't judge a book by its cover. And I had a class that I instructed, and in this class, I had individuals on supervision come to this class along with their families. And one of the first classes I had, there was a lady in the class that was on supervision. She sat in the front row, and every time I said something about the conditions of supervision, she shook her head and said, "Yes, Mr. Winkler." Well, I took that as being in compliance. I said to myself, this individual is going to be a good person on probation. Then I looked in the back of the room during the course of the class. There was an individual in the back of the room, and I remember both their names. His name was Robert. Every time I said something, he kind of had a look on his face like he was not interested. I took that as he's not going to be compliant on supervision. Well, after the class ended, maybe 2 months later, I got a random phone call from a law enforcement officer in that community. And they said, Joe, I want to tell you that one of the individuals that are on supervision, they gave me her name was Dana. We think that she's dealing drugs out of her residence. I remember this lady because she's the one that sat in the front of the room, and she was shaking her head that everything I'd said that she was going to be in compliance with. Well, I told the probation officer what the call that I'd received. We went out and searched the residence, and sure enough, she had drugs in her residence. We went ahead and arrested her. She subsequently got sentenced to prison. And then about a year later, I get a random phone call, and the phone call came from a classification officer. And they said, Mr. Winkler, we want to know if you know where Dana's at. And they gave me her last name. And I said, yeah, I do. And I started to pull up the internal database to tell them where she was at. And they said, no, you don't get it. Dana has escaped from prison. At this point, she was a prison escapee. Once again, this individual was the individual that was sitting in the front of this class, shaking her head with everything that I said in an affirmative or in a positive. Well, she ended up getting caught and got sentenced to a new term of incarceration in prison. And ironically enough, about 2 months later, I get another random phone call. And the phone call came from a guy named Robert. I answered the phone and he said, Mr. Winkler, my name is Robert, gave me his last name. He said, you may not remember who I am. And I remembered who he was because he was the one in the back of the classroom that had negative vibes, had negative body language. And he said, you know, I took your class, and in that class, I learned that how to comply with supervision, and I knew at that point I was never going to be coming back on probation when I got off. And the reason I bring this up is because I judged the book by its cover. I said Dana was going to comply with supervision, and Robert wasn't. I was proven wrong. We have probation officers out there that have some of these same experiences. They may judge a book by its cover, and we can't do that. But at the same time, we have individuals that are on supervision that may do the same thing. They may report to probation. They may talk to their probation officer. The probation officer may not be showing them exactly the attention they want, and they may judge them and say they don't want them to comply or be successful in the community. But the reality is, every probation officer probably wants or should want those individuals to be successful. When they succeed, we all succeed, and we make better communities. So my lesson would be never judge a book by its cover.
Yes.
Great story.
You brought up an excellent point, because I think on both ends, whether it be the probation officer or whether it be the man who's sitting before them that's on probation, I've been there, where I have this sheet of paper that's in front of you, and the only thing that you know about me, it's what's on that sheet of paper. And for the men and the women that are listening, even the probation officers, that piece of paper is that person's past. It can be the person that's sitting in front of you, but there are a lot of instances where that person, I know you've experienced, they've changed. And so just think about if God did everything the way that the court system and probation does, which we all have a job to do, but just think about it in this light, where everything that you've ever done that was offensive to God, every sin was on a piece of paper. And every time you met somebody, before you opened your mouth, they got to look at that piece of paper. Up, he cheated on his test when he was in the 9th grade. Up, he cut school when he was 12. Up, he stole from the store. Wow, he did all of these things. And imagine, without saying a word, everyone got the opportunity to treat you based upon that one piece of paper. You may be 30, 40, or 50 years old and have stopped some of those things or all of those things. One of the things it makes us do, when I think of what you were just talking about, is remaining humble. Deal with the person for who they are today. And from a standpoint, even the person who's looking at their own rap sheet, I'm no longer this person, but like the individual that you just mentioned, I'm going to change that perspective of you looking at that paper. I'm going to give you something different to look at and consider when you see my character. Mm-hmm. If I could leave anyone with anything today, and we're going to be continuing a conversation again at Community Corrections. This is the Death or Prison podcast, brought to you by leanonmeusa.org. I am Johnny Branham. This is Mr. Elmo Golden. This is the Assistant Secretary of Community Corrections, Mr. Joe Winkler in Florida. We've been talking to you about conditions in probation. We've been talking to you about how to keep the community safe. We've been talking to you about the roles of probation officers and how difficult it is to navigate this. But one of the things that I want to leave you all with is the fact that we all have an opportunity to just what I'm going to do right here with this Bible. Turn the page. You have an opportunity today to turn the page. You can't change the past, because the past is etched in stone, but you can turn the page on the past. There's some information at the bottom of the screen that's going to allow your family members to get in contact with a welcoming, mentoring church near them. It is so important, because one of the things that is the connector in all of this, the connector in being successful, is God. The Bible says that I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. Remember that. You can get through that probation. If you're a probation officer, you can help those individuals in the community. If you're a family member, you can get through these times. This has been the Death or Prison podcast. What we say, choose life.
One boy and girl, maybe we can change the world. Whenever I'm in trouble, I know there's a place where I can hide, safe from the storms that rage. I know that there's a refuge where I can find peace, where you take me, hold me, safe in your love. I'm captured by your love, surrendered to running to you when I once ran away. Now all my defenses, Lord, I lay them here at your feet. I'm captured by